Yo, what's going on YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and we are taking a look today at some news around the Chicago Blackhawks. There is some change coming to the organization. We got a sense of the direction of the team moving into the next couple of seasons with their new general manager as Kyle Davidson named the 10th general manager in Chicago Blackhawks history. So we got an idea from his press conference what he sees is next for the Blackhawks over the next couple years. We also go over some of the latest trade rumors around the Hawks, around some guys that we have talked about, some guys we haven't talked about. And at the end of today's video, we talk about number 88, Patrick Kane, and his legacy of the Chicago Blackhawks. If they decide that they do want to move him, what does it mean for Kane? What does it mean for the franchise, the fans? So we'll go over all that at the end. So let's start off with the big news, right? And that is the Blackhawks naming their 10th general manager, Kyle Davidson. Davidson's been with the organization for a little while, and that's where some people are a little bit maybe skeptical of this hiring. Now, it's a good hiring for the team. It's his first general manager gig in the NHL, but there are some questions because the problem is he was part of those championship teams, which unfortunately a lot of people, at least outside of the Blackhawks, are they want completely new people in. And Kyle Davidson was a part of that whole situation, maybe from an outside perspective, but he was in that, he was around the team during that time. So people are always going to have that against him. I'm not going to do that. I'm giving him the benefit of the doubt here. But based off of what he said, he definitely can talk the talk. He said some really good things in his press conference. So this is from Ben Pope, who was a journalist at the press conference. Davidson on the Blackhawks, we're a long way from where we want and need to be as a team, and we intend to rebuild this on and off the ice. No matter if it takes 3 years, 5 years to reach the level we want to achieve, it's important that when we get there, we stay there. So he wants more longevity. He doesn't want just a 1 year good spark and then it just all goes away. Then following that up, Davidson said, what the fans can get excited about is this is going to be new. There's going to be a lot of change coming, and we've already seen some of that, and I'll get to that in a second. Davidson asked if he'll rebuild or retool, and this was from Kyle Davidson. We're looking at more of a rebuild here. So, it's not a little retool. They're not going to just get rid of 1, 2, 3, 4 players. I think that's part of the questioning right now in a city like Philadelphia. The Flyers, we don't know if they're retooling or rebuilding now that they're going to be losing guys like Ristolainen, Claude Giroux. So, I think with the Blackhawks, we have more of a sense. This is going to be a pretty big teardown. And this is the last thing from the press conference. We need to rebuild our prospect pool. We need to rebuild our roster in general, and that takes time. So since then, what has Kyle Davidson done? He's already made some moves. So the Blackhawks have fired assistant general manager Ryan Stewart and vice president of amateur scouting Mark Kelly. Those guys have been with the team for 15 years and won those 3 Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks in the 2010s. So that's a pretty big thing to happen there. That was definitely a little bit eye-opening very early on in Kyle Davidson's tenure as GM. Now we also got a new addition. So this is from Frank Saravelli, expecting that former Stanley Cup winner and current Blackhawks development coach Brian Campbell to take on a significant role in Chicago's front office to work hand in hand with Davidson to rebuild the Chicago Blackhawks. So I think that's interesting. A guy that's been in the organization through some winning years, which some people like to forget, some people like to look back at still. So that's an interesting thought. So Brian Campbell could be ending up making more of an impact on this team than just what looked at the time when they traded for him from Florida as just a rental defenseman at the deadline, having a significant role in the organization a decade later. So now this is from Mark Lazarus and Scott Powers. Henrik Borgstrom doesn't have much trade value, but the Blackhawks would probably like to move him if they could. Unlikely Chicago re-signs Ryan Carpenter for next year, and Calvin DeHaan likely the surest bet to be traded. So we're going to break this apart, the three different players here. So Henrik Borgstrom is a guy, if you guys remember, he was a Florida Panthers draft pick, and he never really turned out. The hope was he could be a top six power forward and could develop into that type of guy in Florida. Never really ended up happening. So Henrik Borgstrom actually requested a trade out of Florida, left the United States, left Florida, and said, until I get traded, I'm not coming back to North America. Since then, he has been traded for not very much for the Panthers. They definitely lost a lot from that high early draft pick in Borgstrom. He goes to Chicago, and it sounds like we're kind of seeing the same story. Maybe he's just not as good of a player as he thought he was, because at the time, he didn't think he was getting enough minutes in the Florida Panthers lineup. He wanted to be playing top six. He was developing in the bottom six, and it kind of sounds like that same situation has happened here in Chicago. So I do see a situation here where he goes overseas. I do see that as a real possibility here. Maybe one more team takes a shot at him on a PTO in training camp later this year in the fall, but it's not looking too great for Henrik Borgstrom. So now we talk about Ryan Carpenter. So Ryan Carpenter has a pretty long history in the NHL. He was a player with the New Jersey Devils for a very long time. That's kind of where he got his really got his head on his shoulders and became an NHL player. He eventually ended up going to the Vegas Golden Knights in the expansion draft, and he ended up being a good player for them, especially in their first playoff season, that inaugural season in 2018. So he's a guy that has been in Chicago, just kind of stayed on the low. He's actually played a little bit in Rockford with the Ice Hogs. So I could see Carpenter being a guy that if you're a team right now that's maybe close to missing the play, I could see a Western Conference team taking him, like the Ducks, or the Kings, or the Oilers, or the Stars for that matter. A team that doesn't want, if they're going to trade assets out, he's a guy that could come back in and kind of take on some roles. Obviously not to the degree of some of the guys they'll lose, but he's a proven NHL player with playoff experience. So if they do get into the postseason, he could help them in that regard. So I think that's something that teams will definitely see as a valuable asset at the deadline and probably won't cost you a first, a second, or even a third round draft pick. Calvin DeHaan seems like the most sure to get traded. The thing is with DeHaan, he's not the high marquee defenseman that we're talking about at this year's deadline. There's a lot of bigger names out there, like Jacob Chikrin, like John Klingberg, Giordano, Hampus Lindholm. You go down the list, Ben Sherratt. So he's kind of more that secondary, tertiary defenseman as a rental teams are going to look at, and kind of like Carpenter, but as a defenseman, I could see Calvin DeHaan being a nice veteran addition somewhere. He has some playoff experience under his belt with the New York Islanders, so he does have that little bit, of a playoff mentality when it's needed. And I think he's, again, similar teams on the West Coast I could see going after a guy like DeHaan. Good puck-moving defenseman. For the most part, has stayed fairly healthy, but injuries have started to affect him with age. But I think that's a guy that teams will definitely be looking at as well. So now this is an interesting one from Chris Johnston. Following up what we heard a couple weeks ago, maybe a trade back to Vegas. Kelly McCrimmon, the Golden Knights general manager, quickly shut that down. That will not be happening. But we're now starting to hear more about Marc-Andre Fleury, and this is the latest. So this from Chris Johnston. It sounds like that at this point in time, Marc-Andre Fleury is leaning towards finishing out this season in Chicago. There's still time for him to change his mind, but at this point, it doesn't sound like he is inclined to move. He does have a no-move clause, full no-move clause, so he has total autonomy on if/where he would get traded. Let's remember, guys, at the beginning of this year, the expectations for the Hawks were they could be a playoff team, potentially, with guys like Seth Jones coming in, Marc-Andre Fleury. So this sentiment was maybe not what they had pictured in the beginning. And I don't think, Fleury would have gone to Chicago last year had he known that this team wouldn't be a playoff team, because now he's moving around once again, and that's not really what he wants to do for 3 or 4 months up until the end of the year. His family, he already uprooted his family from Vegas, bringing them to Chicago with him. I could see this being a situation wherever he wants to sign this summer, he's going to have another full no move clause, and I hate to say it, I could see it being somewhere on the West Coast, kind of being where he wants to go. And I think that's, again, I could see Montreal being an interest of him, but again, I don't know how real interested he is in that from his perspective, but that is definitely something that is a pretty interesting report. We know he's been turning down a couple trades to the Washington Capitals. The Capitals have definitely been kicking the tires on Fleury over in Chicago, but it sounds like more likely than not right now, he is going to stick it out in Chicago for the remainder of this season. Now we're starting to hear some stuff about maybe a link to the Ottawa Senators for forward Dylan Strome. From David Paginotta, the Ottawa Senators have been linked to Blackhawks forward Dylan Strome. Dylan Strome's been on the trade block throughout the entire season. Even in training camp, Dylan Strome was on the block. That's really when we first started hearing that talk. Nothing's really materialized. I think teams are going to see Dylan Strome, a team like Ottawa, as a guy that maybe was kind of almost treating it like a player tryout for the rest of this season. It's almost to that stage. And I think teams like the Senators, like the Sabres for that matter, will maybe look at a guy like Dylan Strome and just see what he has left. This could be, again, kind of a situation like Borgstrom. This is his last hope in the NHL. And if he doesn't figure it out here, he may be going overseas into Europe as soon as this fall. So now we get to the good stuff, as we're going to talk about Patrick Kane with the Chicago Blackhawks. So recently there's been some talk about maybe rumors of Patrick Kane getting traded out of Chicago. Now, I think that's a big deal thing. We've talked about this as soon as last summer, as recently as then, and I think that talk has not really gone away, because if you're talking about a full-on rebuild and not a retool for the Blackhawks, who are they keeping? All right, so let's say, hypothetically, you're keeping Seth Jones, Caleb Jones, Kane, Taze, and I guess you could say probably Kirby Dach. So you're talking about 5 guys. And now you throw in maybe a guy like Kurashev, maybe 6, but I'm going to say 5. Those 5 guys, if that's all you're keeping, everything else gets blown up. So is that a rebuild, or is that just a retool? To what extent do you call a full-on retool or a rebuild? Does everybody have to go? So that's the kind of thing that I think a lot of people are kind of asking themselves. When you talk about a rebuild, does Patrick Kane and Jonathan Taze want to be with the Blackhawks through that? So that's something that has been talked about, and that's actually what we heard about here from Mark Lazarus. The current Blackhawks management would only entertain the idea of trading Patrick Kane if he brought it up himself. His legacy matters to him too. Becoming Chicago's all-time leader in every major category is also a real goal of Patrick Kane's. So that is definitely something to consider. If Patrick Kane wants to stay in Chicago, he wants to be the greatest Chicago Blackhawk player ever, he would have to stick it out for the next couple years of his contract, which may mean he's jeopardizing playoff and Stanley Cup success. But to be fair, Patrick Kane has already won 3 Stanley Cups. So is it for the Cups, or is it his competitive nature saying, I want to be the best player in Chicago? Or is it more leaning toward, I want to win more Cups? And that's kind of the decision that ultimately looks like, according to management, is going to be on Patrick Kane's shoulders, and Kane's shoulders alone. So that's definitely something to look at. This is from Elliot Friedman as well, kind of spinning the tires on that. The Chicago Blackhawks have been asked about forward Patrick Kane. We've also heard now most recently, which I'll be making a video about next week, the Colorado Avalanche have started to maybe peek around on the idea of a Patrick Kane trade. How crazy would that be? Just the thought of that just blows my mind. But I think there's definitely reason to believe you're not doing if you're a general manager in the NHL, you're not doing your job if you're not calling the Blackhawks about Kane. Kane, whatever trade that the Blackhawks get for Kane, it's not going to be worth Patrick Kane, if we're being completely honest. So that is definitely something to consider here. So that is it for the Patrick Kane talk for the Chicago Blackhawks. New general manager, couple trade rumors. Fleury, he may be sticking around past the deadline, as well as that stuff on Kane. So guys, as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you again next time.